I know what you're all thinking. I mean, what? A Swedish empire? Yeah, I mean, who would have thought that a neutral until recently country with such a small population could ever have had an empire? But yeah, no, I'm not lying. Sweden had an empire in the 17th and early 18th centuries. So, where does it all begin? A man called Gustavus Adolphus. So, this guy became king of Sweden in 1611 after his father died. And he was only 17, so all of Sweden's enemies could smell blood. He inherited 3 wars from his dad, so one with Denmark-Norway, one with Russia, and finally a dynastic struggle with Poland-Lithuania. But his opponents severely underestimated him. He had actually joined the army when he was 11 years old, so yeah, he was a very exceptional military commander, and at a similar age he was already learning the art of statecraft. So using his skill and his cunning, he was able to defend the lands of Sweden in all 3 of the wars. One example of this cunning occurred during a siege where his garrison was greatly outnumbered and any attack on the fort would have resulted in it falling. To prevent the attack on the fort, he placed a load of helmets, more than there were people, on the ramparts, which persuaded his enemies that there was a full garrison. And it worked. They didn't actually attack the fort. So Gustavus Adolphus's most kind of big contribution to Sweden was entering the 30 Years' War with the country. So, yeah, he was the reigning king when Sweden intervened in 1628. And initially it was incredibly successful. So the Swedes landed in northern Germany, making the Prussian town of Elbing their base of operations. And in quick time, much of northern Germany was consolidated under Swedish control. And this was mostly down to the fact that many of the northern German states were also Protestants like Sweden. And actually approximately half of the states of the Holy Roman Empire were conquered by Sweden in the war, at Sweden's kind of peak conquered territorial extent. And the key battle was the First Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, and this was won by Gustavus. And it actually opened them up to be able to do a kind of southern German campaign. But Gustavus was actually died like just a year later at the Battle of Lutzen, where Sweden lost much of the prestige and many of the allies that it had made in northern Germany. And a further Swedish defeat at the Battle of Nordlingen in 1634 forced their retreat from positions in southern Germany. So the war continued and dragged on until 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. So why was the Swedish army so good during the war? Well, Gustavus Adolphus had been a pioneer of military tactics, and is seen to be one of the earliest employers of a combined arms strategy on the battlefield. Furthermore, he insisted on an incredibly mobile army, which made it very difficult to shatter his army on the battlefield. Artillery became integral to Swedish battles and were used to overwhelm enemies, whilst maintaining actually enough mobility to become incredibly effective, alongside the other parts of his army, such as cavalry and even regular infantry. In army camps, none of the soldiers of Sweden were allowed to have any kind of gold or silver, so luxury was very much distant in Swedish army camps, and this equality greatly motivated the Swedish soldiers. I mean, even the king wasn't allowed to have very many forms of luxury either. Swedish soldiers were also not allowed to loot foreign cities, and any soldiers found doing so would be court-martialed and then shot. So this inspired a high level of discipline within the army, and that was incredibly important in terms of keeping their morale and making sure that they didn't break their lines during battles. So what happened after the 30 Years' War? Well, peace was signed in 1648, and this was called the Peace of Westphalia. Sweden gained a whole bunch of land. So, for example, they gained western Pomerania, as well as a stretch of farther Pomerania, the town of Wismar, and the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden. And these are all on the North German coast. On this map here, they are the ones in grey. And on top of this, the Swedish were also paid 5 million Riksdaler. So just before the end of the 30 Years' War, the Swedes actually decided to invade Denmark as well. So this happens in 1643. And this is called the Torstensson War. So Sweden launched an invasion of the Scanian provinces of Denmark. And these are actually the provinces that nowadays constitute southern Sweden. So yeah, it was actually called the Torstensson War after the Swedish field marshal who led the invasion. Afterwards, Sweden had conquered the Norwegian province of Jämtland, as well as the islands of Gotland and Ösel. Sweden was also exempted from the Sound Toll, which was a duty levied on trade passing through the Öresund Straits. So yeah, those are basically between Copenhagen and Scania there, as seen on the map. So, as we said before, Gustavus Adolphus had actually died during the 30 Years' War, and he was succeeded by Queen Christina. But she spent much of the treasury and brought the country almost to the brink of bankruptcy, and obviously this caused a lot of unrest, domestic unrest. So she abdicated in favour of a kinsman called Charles X. Now, Charles X was quite a good military commander, but an even sharper politician. He was responsible for the reduction of the nobles in Sweden. So this basically meant that the nobility in Sweden had gained too much power, and he wanted to cut down on this. They had grown very powerful because of the acquisition of many new territories within Sweden, which they had taken as their own land rather than relinquished to the crown as crown land. So the result was a choice for the nobles. Either they had to pay a tax yearly on the land that they'd acquired, or they had to forfeit a quarter of it directly to the crown. And most opted for a yearly tax, which was retrospective back until the death of Gustavus Adolphus. So approximately 20 years or so, maybe slightly less. And overall, a progressive tax was levied on all areas of society, yet the nobles were hardest hit, being the richest part of Swedish society at the time. And at the end of his reign in 1654, Charles led an invasion of Poland and Lithuania, only to promptly die of exhaustion. So in the chaos and the aftermath of that, we actually see the high watermark of the Swedish Empire, because the Swedes quickly negotiated a peace which secured their control over Livonia, which is roughly modern-day Latvia. And they also made sure that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth renounced their claim to the Swedish crown. There had been a large ongoing dynastic struggle between the two, as mentioned before. The Danes also signed a treaty with Sweden, which gave Sweden control over all of Scania and the Norwegian province of Bohuslän, at the cost of returning Trøndelag to Norway. And the Russo-Swedish War was also concluded in 1661, where Russia ceded Karelia, Ingria and Estonia to Sweden. And on the map here you can actually see the greatest territorial extent of the Swedish Empire. But unfortunately, since the Swedes were now at the top, this only left one way for the Swedish Empire to go now: downhill.